Good evening. I'm Steve Weberg. I'm with the Public Affairs staff of the Kansas City Public Library, and I really want to thank you for being here, for joining us this evening. It's nice to be in here in the cool, for one thing, rather than outside, but also it's nice to be here back with the Command and General Staff College again. I know that's why many of you are here. Those guys are just without a doubt our best partners in our programming and have been for a long, long time. So tonight we're going to dig into one of the greatest Civil War films ever produced, Glory. And it's the sixth installment of what has been just a terrific Hollywood versus History series in partnership with the Command and General Staff College. You may already know that we have the next entry in that series scheduled in 2 weeks on June 27th, examining the film industry's work kind of as a whole during World War II, and looking in particular at the seminal Best Picture Oscar winner, The Best Years of Our Lives. And I'm happy to tell you that beyond that, with the Command and General Staff College, we've now extended this series through the end of the year. We'll do an episode a month. And that'll start with a fact versus fiction assessment of the classic The Great Escape, the second Monday in July. So always you can look at our library, kclibrary.org/events for the particulars, and we'll look forward to having you. And we'll have other programs that we've talked about tonight with the Command and General Staff College outside of this film series. Again, they've just been terrific partners, and we know that applause is for them, and that's very deserving. Remember, too, that we archive video for these events, for all of our library events, or for almost all of our library signature events on the library's YouTube channel. And so they're available for viewing, at your leisure, at your family's leisure, at your friend's leisure. Spread the word around. These film series, the Hollywood versus History events, have drawn more than 1,500 views since we started it just a couple, 3 months ago. So you can always go there, or you can always refer a friend there if they weren't able to get here for the actual event. I hope you've had a chance tonight to stop at the informational table just before the entrance into the auditorium out there. It's set up by the Command and General Staff College Foundation, which supports the college in its critical role of educating our country's military leaders, and it helps in many ways to connect the American public to the Army. So they've got, if you're interested in the Command and General Staff College, if you're interested maybe even in helping with the Foundation's work, I know they're happy to visit with you. We're honored tonight to have with us the chair of the Foundation's Board of Trustees, retired General Brian Wampler, tonight. He spent 32 years in active duty. He enlisted as a combat engineer in the Kansas Army National Guard, served in Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom. He commanded the 143rd Expeditionary Sustainment Command, overseeing more than 10,000 soldiers in 97 Army Reserve units in 7 different states. Also with us here is retired Lieutenant General John Miller. He's a former commandant of the Command and General Staff College, and he's the emeritus chair of the Foundation Board. And we also have another member of the current board with us, Benny Lee. General Wampler, General Miller, Mr. Lee, I wonder if I could ask you to stand up and please join me in applauding the service that they've given us and the work that they're doing. I also, once again, want to extend our gratitude to the late Jerry Rosenblum, in whose memory we present this program and the Hollywood versus History series. It's made possible by a generous gift from his estate. So he, in part, is why we're here as well. Now, if you're like me, you're amazed at the depth of the Command and General Staff College's roster of historians. Depth and quality. This is the third time the library's been able to lean on Harry Laver, who spoke in 2019 on the liberation of Paris from German occupation during World War II, and he spoke in 2016 on the true story of George Washington's crossing of the Delaware River in 1776. So it occurred to me every 3 years, Harry is truly a once-in-a-blue-moon kind of a guy. Harry's a professor at the Command and General Staff College's, in the college's Department of Military History. Before that, he was a professor of history and political science at Southeastern Louisiana University. He has a doctorate in history from the University of Kentucky. He has an undergraduate, if I recall, in zoology. I'd like to talk to him about that. He was a Fulbright scholar, and he's the author of 2 books, The Leadership of Ulysses S. Grant and Citizens More Than Soldiers, the Kentucky Militia and Society in the Early Republic. His examination tonight of glory, which revolves around the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, one of the first African-American units to fight for the North during the Civil War. It's timely as we approach our nation's observance of Juneteenth, and not a coincidence that we scheduled it at this particular time. And this commemorates, of course, the effective end of slavery in the United States on June 19th, 1865. As always, we'll have a few questions. We'll have a little bit of time for a few questions at the end. We'll set up some microphones here in the front a little bit later on, and we'll ask you to make use of those. Harry will holler at you if you holler out from the audience. And we'll set those microphones up a little bit later on. Now, would you all please join me in welcoming Harry Laver back to the library. Harry, it's great to have you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Well, good evening, and thank you for coming out on a fairly warm and humid night. So I appreciate you being here. My thanks as well to Steve and everyone here at the Kansas City Public Library for continuing this relationship with the Command and General Staff College, and especially this series of History versus Hollywood. My colleagues and I, we always enjoy coming down. And so thanks to them for continuing this. I also want to take a quick moment to thank one of my colleagues in the Department of Military History up at Fort Leavenworth, and that is Chris Johnson, who is our liaison with the library, and it is up to him. He's lingering there in the back of the room right now. He is the one who sort of corrals us in the department and convinces us to come down and do a talk and reminds us of how much fun it is to come down here. So Chris, thanks for your efforts in continuing work on that. It's appreciated. Well, the title of this series is History versus Hollywood. And historians, many of my colleagues have correctly pointed out that historically based films often are factually challenged. And this is something I cannot disagree with. Such historically based films are really plagued with all kind of historical inaccuracies. But because of the deficiencies in those films, I think we often overlook some of the lessons that those movies can actually teach us about the past. In other words, in that battle of history versus Hollywood, sometimes history can score a point or two. They may not ever win the game, but they'll at least score some points in those kind of films. Now, historically based films have been around almost as long as there have been films. One of the earliest of those films, and one of the earliest war movies, was the 1915 film Birth of a Nation. Now, its inaccuracies and falsehoods and racist tropes are at this point legendary. They are epic. But nevertheless, the director of that film, this man, D.W. Griffith, was one of the pioneers in filmmaking back in the early 20th century. And at that point, he made 3 predictions about historically based films. Number 1, he said that most people will get their historical knowledge from films. Secondly, he said that films would have a greater emotional impact on audiences than books or the classroom. And third, he said that historical films would provide an accurate and authentic window into the past. Well, the third one is pretty problematic, which is part of the origin of this speaker series. And that's what most of us as professional historians focus on, are the just awful history that is in so many of these films. But tonight, I'd like to focus a little bit more on his first 2 points in relation to glory, and in fact, really, I think we could say all war films. And this I can probably best do by taking his first 2 points, again, that most people will get their historical knowledge from films, and films will provide an emotional connection to the past, and combine them into really just one proposition. And that is that for many Americans, historical films really provide their only emotional link to the past. Now, in this room, I'm sure many of you remember when Jay Leno or David Letterman would go out on the street and ask people historically based questions, test their historical knowledge. And I'm sure you recall as well that most seem to have essentially no historical, in fact, maybe even worse, just really, really bad historical knowledge about our nation's past. And I don't know that Wikipedia has improved that over the years, right? Because any number of cable news personalities skim a Wikipedia page and they're then experts on whatever historical topic it is that they're talking about. But for the typical American, I suspect that one of the reasons for their lack of historical knowledge is that there is a lack of feeling, of an emotional connection, that there's nothing that really draws our hearts to the past. And maybe our hearts have to lead before our heads will follow. So here's one of the values, I think, of historical movies, such as glory. They have the ability, to a degree that historians, and let's be honest here, that historians can rarely achieve in making that emotional connection. Those kind of films can create that connection between an audience and the past. A connection that may lead to further interest, to further reading, to further study, and then improved historical knowledge. So with those initial observations out of the way, let's talk about the film that we're going to look at tonight, Glory, and some of the history behind it. Now, the movie was released in 1989, over 30 years ago. It's just hard to remember, or hard to imagine that it's been that long since Glory came out. Of course, the 3 stars that we see here, Matthew Broderick, Denzel Washington, and Morgan Freeman. The story of the Massachusetts 54th Infantry Regiment of Volunteers and its commander. The film was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, and it won 3. 1 for Best Sound, 1 for Cinematography, and Denzel Washington winning Best Supporting Actor. And really, for just about any organization that gave out awards for movies at that point, Glory racked up any number of awards, including right here in Kansas City. The Kansas City Film Critics Circle gave Glory its award for Best Film, Best Director, and Denzel Washington again for Best Supporting Actor. Well, despite what the film suggests, the men of the 54th were not the first African Americans to fight in the war. In fact, almost as soon as the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in South Carolina in April of 1861, there were proposals to arm African Americans and create black units, which really is not surprising given that everyone knew that the war was driven primarily by the issue of slavery, if not exclusively, primarily by the issue of slavery. Well, one of the first attempts to organize a black unit was undertaken by this man, General David Hunter. who commanded Union forces along the southeast coast of the United States, sort of along the South Carolina, Georgia coast, little small pockets here and there. And in March of 1862, General Hunter organized the first South Carolina colored infantry regiment. Now, as soon as President Lincoln heard of this, he sent word to General Hunter rejecting the idea and telling Hunter he had no authority as a military commander in the field to undertake such radical actions. Now, the first South Carolina would sort of hang around, but not under official U.S. government sanction. Then a little bit later the same year, closer to home, just across the border, U.S. Senator and at the time General James H. Lane, not maybe necessarily the inspiring military commander, organized the first Kansas Colored Infantry Regiment, August 5th of 1862. And while they would participate in a number of skirmishes and a number of operations, they did so without U.S. government sanction. That would come, but it would come much later in the war. And then almost simultaneously, well to the south in New Orleans, General Benjamin Butler, also maybe not necessarily an inspiring military figure, accepted into service two black militia regiments, the 1st and the 3rd Louisiana Native Guards. Now, the 1st Native Guards were made up of free men of color from the New Orleans area. The 3rd Native Guards were made up of men who formerly had been slaves. And the War Department did accept them into federal service. Now, among those who were encouraging, advocating, even pleading for African American men to be allowed to enroll in the United States Army was this man, Frederick Douglass. Born into slavery, Douglass liberated himself by running away to the north, and by this point in the early 1860s, Douglass was one of the leading advocates for abolition and known across the country. And Douglass encouraged the Lincoln administration to accept black men into federal service, saying in part this: "This is no time to fight only with your white hand and allow your black hand to remain tied. Men in earnest don't fight with one hand when they might fight with two. A man drowning would not refuse to be saved even by a colored man." Well, again, this is quite early in the war, and President Lincoln was reluctant to move too quickly on such sensitive issues as emancipation and the enlistment of black men in federal service. And the same month that Butler and Lane were organizing their regiments, to the newsman Horace Greeley, who was editor of the New York Tribune, Lincoln explained, saying this: "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery." He went on to say, explaining further, that if he could save the Union by freeing all of the slaves, he would. If he could save the Union by freeing none of the slaves, he would. And if he could save the Union by freeing some and not other slaves, he would. And he reiterated, "My paramount objective is to save the Union." Well, by the late summer of 1862, Lincoln had come to accept Frederick Douglass's logic and decided to change the course of the war, and indeed change the course of American history, by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation that would go into effect January 1st of 1863. Now, the proclamation, I'm sure as many of you in this room know, did not abolish the institution of slavery. Instead, it freed those slaves in areas of the country that were in rebellion. But for our purposes tonight, maybe more relevant and lesser known is a clause of the proclamation that said that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed services of the United States. And with that, accepting black soldiers into federal service became official U.S. government policy. Now, there were many in the North who celebrated both the proclamation and the opportunity for black men to enroll in federal service, but it was not universal. Any number of individuals who initially had supported the Lincoln administration and the war effort declined. In fact, rejected the idea of such a dramatic, some said even revolutionary policy change. And one of those individuals was Illinois Republican Party leader James Conkling. And Conkling and Lincoln had a history that went way back. They had been friends and colleagues working together in the Republican Party in Illinois before the war. And Conkling told Lincoln, he demanded of Lincoln that he repeal the proclamation. And if Lincoln didn't, Conkling said he could no longer support the war effort. Well, Lincoln, in the way that he seemed to do so easily, cut to the heart of matter in his response, saying, "You say you will not fight to free the Negroes. Some of them seem willing to fight for you. But no matter, fight you then exclusively to save this Union." Well, Frederick Douglass was one who recognized the greater significance of this change of policy and maybe more importantly, this change of sentiment in the country. And Douglass said this, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket. And there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right of citizenship in these United States." Well, even those on the other side of the conflict recognized the validity of Douglass's assessment. Georgian and Confederate General Hal Cobb acknowledged as much when he made the observation, and I'm sure he made this observation reluctantly: "The day you make soldiers of them is the beginning of the end of the revolution. If slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong." So by the summer of 1863, thousands of men were now enlisting to fight in the uniform of the United States. And in order to better organize so many volunteers, the War Department, on May 22nd of 1863, established the USCT, the United States Color Troops. And many of those regiments that had been organized previously were transitioned into USCT troops. So the 1st and the 3rd Louisiana Native Guard, although we still refer to them that way, they became the 73rd and the 75th USCT. There were a small handful of regiments that were allowed to keep their state designation, and the Massachusetts 54th was one of those. Now, in the film's postscript, at the very end of the film, there's some text that sort of gives something of the rest of the story. And in that postscript, it gives the impression that because of the 54th, quoting here, Congress at last authorized the raising of black troops throughout the Union. But as we can see, the USCT was already organized before the 54th had engaged in any significant fight. And in fact, any number of regiments had been organized even before the 54th and fought in battles before the 54th as well. One of the earliest and most significant unit-sized fights of African American soldiers came on May 27th, 1863, at a place just north of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Port Hudson. And Port Hudson was similar to Vicksburg. Up to the north in Mississippi was Vicksburg, that Confederate bastion that prohibited Union transport up and down the river. Well, to the south was Port Hudson. It was kind of a mini Vicksburg that Confederates controlled as well, and allowed them to dominate the 110 miles or so between those two cities. Well, the 1st and 3rd Louisiana Native Guards were given part of the responsibility for assaulting Port Hudson. And on May the 27th, Confederate forces had deployed on high bluffs overlooking a very flat floodplain over which the 1st and the 3rd were going to have to assault. But that morning, they formed up in a tree line and then moved out under cover of those trees and began making their way as quickly as they possibly could over 600 yards of open ground. At about 200 yards advancement, they began to take a murderous artillery and small arms fire. One African-American captain, Andre Callot from New Orleans, was shouting orders in both English and French until he was hit in his left arm, and then it just hung useless by his side. But he continued to advance until he was hit again, falling mortally wounded. The 1st and the 3rd continued, but at about 200 yards from the Confederate positions, they simply couldn't advance any further, and they began to fall back. Those who witnessed that assault on both sides gave testament to the determination and the courage of the 1st and 3rd Louisiana Native Guards. And then not even a week later, on June the 7th of 1863, at a place called Milliken's Bend, which is just directly across the river from Vicksburg. You recall Vicksburg at this point of the war was encircled by an army commanded by U.S. Grant. And on June the 7th, Confederate forces attempted to fight their way across the river to relieve the garrison that was there in Vicksburg. 4 African-American regiments stood in their way. And in difficult, brutal fighting, one of those regiments suffered 45% killed or mortally wounded. And those are losses that rival even those of the famed 1st Minnesota at Gettysburg. But now let's turn to the 54th. The idea for an African-American regiment in Massachusetts originated with the state's governor, a man named John Andrew, a committed abolitionist. And by late January of 1863, the unit began to organize itself. It was to be offered officered by sons of prominent New England abolitionist families. And the other expectation was that those officers would have seen the elephant in the terms of the day or having seen combat previously. And although a state regiment, the 54th drew volunteers really from across the country. Free men of color and former slaves from 16 different states volunteered to join the 54th. Speculation, some even from Canada joined in. 2 of Frederick Douglass's sons, Charles and Lewis, were volunteers, and Lewis became the regiment's sergeant major. Then in April, Governor Andrew appointed Boston-born, 26-year-old Robert Gould Shaw to be the regiment's commander. Shaw had volunteered at the very start of the war. He had fought with the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry at Winchester, at Cedar Mountain, and at the Battle of Antietam, by which point he had risen to the rank of captain. As for the 54th, Shaw was reluctant to take command. He knew that accepting that position carried the considerable risk of ridicule, if not even ostracism, within the U.S. Army, if not even within the larger white community. He also hesitated because he had his own self-doubts about his ability to carry out the responsibilities of the rank of colonel, whether it was a black regiment or a white regiment. But nevertheless, he accepted command, and by most accounts, he was not the rather timid Shaw that we see in the film. Instead, he was extraordinarily firm and extraordinarily fair. And somewhat depicted more accurately in the film, he was absolutely committed to preparing his men for the fight that he believed was coming. The men of the 54th were equally committed, despite all the challenges that they faced, from the initial lack of weapons and uniforms. One black sergeant made an observation about this, saying, "We've been to the armory of God and had received weapons of the heart, That made us daring and dangerous foes, men to be reckoned with. But really, in what was just a few short weeks, the 54th was on its way south. And the first operation in which the 54th participated was the now infamous raid on Darien, Georgia, that came June the 4th of 1863. It was part of an expedition along the Georgia coast commanded by a colonel named James Montgomery. And the town of Darien was found essentially abandoned. And Colonel Montgomery gave the orders for the town to be plundered. Shaw objected, refused to issue the orders. Montgomery, being the senior officer, simply ignored Shaw and directed the soldiers himself. Then, when Montgomery ordered the town to be burned, Shaw again objected, again refusing to issue orders to the 54th. And again, Montgomery ignored Shaw and ordered the 54th to join his own regiment in carrying out the burning of the town. Afterwards, Shaw wrote of his disgust and his embarrassment, especially for his men, who he knew were better than that and were so well trained and so disciplined. The first fight for the 54th against organized Confederates came a few weeks later, on July the 16th of 1863, on James Island, not far from Charleston, South Carolina. It's one of the barrier islands off the coast. And there on James Island, in an early morning battle, the 54th held off repeated and concerted attacks by Confederates, exchanging volleys of fire and then standing up to a bayonet charge and hand-to-hand fighting. And by doing so, they protected the nearby 10th Connecticut Volunteers. And afterwards, one of the 10th Connecticut said that the 54th had fought like heroes. Shaw was especially gratified at his men's performance that day. They had stood as men, shoulder to shoulder, with white soldiers, and they had done their job. Well, best known is, and the climactic scene of the film, is the 54th assault on Fort Wagner on Morris Island, which was part of the defenses around Charleston Harbor. After the fight at James Island on July 16th, the 54th then conducted an all-night march and went into camp on the 17th, anticipating the following day to join in the assault on Fort Wagner. The next morning, the morning of the 18th, they crossed the small ribbon of water that separated James Island from Morris Island and began preparations for the assault. The fort was manned by 1,700 Confederates, 17 artillery pieces, and was protected by a 3-foot deep moat. It was a formidable fortification. And despite knowing that the assault would have to be made over a mile of open beach, Shaw volunteered the 640 men of the 54th to lead the assault. The plan was that then successive regiments would follow in support. Well, late in the afternoon of the 18th, the 54th had formed up its ranks and was waiting for the command to begin the assault. And at that point, the brigade commander, General George Strong, rode up to encourage the men. And he told them, don't stop and fire. Get across that open ground as quickly as you can. Move fast. Then rely on the bayonet once you get to the fort. Now in the film, facing his men, Colonel Shaw points at the flag bearer and asks, if this man should fall, who will lift the flag and carry it on? And his boyhood friend Thomas steps forward and says, I will. In actuality, it was General Strong who asked the question, and it was Colonel Shaw who stepped forward and said, I will. And this is really not inconsequential at all, because by doing that, Shaw sent a message to his men that he was going to lead them in this attack. He was going to be at the point of the greatest danger, and he was going to share in all the risks that they were going to share in crossing that mile-wide open expanse of beach. Well, then the 54th moved out, first at the quick step, then at the double quick. Looking to cross that open killing ground as rapidly as they could, they began to take artillery fire first and then small arms fire. But with Shaw at the front, they made their way into the moat, made their way across the moat, and began clawing their way up the sand embankments. Shaw was on top of the fort when he was struck in the chest by a bullet, fell back into his men, likely killed almost instantly. The man bearing the flag did fall, but it was immediately taken up by Sergeant William Kearney, who then made his way up the embankment and planted the flag on the outer walls of the fort, despite having suffered wounds to both legs, wounds to one arm, and another wound to the chest. The following regiments did arrive, and after some brief hand-to-hand fighting, it became obvious the fort could not be taken. And then over the next few hours, under cover of darkness, the 54th and the others began to withdraw. One of those who made his way back to Union lines was Sergeant Kearney, still carrying the flag, for which he was later awarded the Medal of Honor. That day, the 54th suffered 40% casualties, including, of course, Colonel Shaw, and the dead were all buried in a mass grave. No further assaults took place against Fort Wagner. 6 weeks later, it was taken, but by siege operations, the recognition it simply could not be taken by a frontal assault. Now, the film suggests that this was the end of the story for the 54th. But in fact, the 54th continued to fight throughout the rest of the war in a number of skirmishes, including the fairly significant Battle of Olustee, Florida in February of 1864. Well, now let's take a look at a couple of scenes from the film. The clip's going to begin the night before the assault, with the enlisted men around a campfire, preparing themselves psychologically for what they know is coming the next day. The film then transitions to the following day as the 54th is forming up, readying for the assault. And worth recalling at this point that by July of 1863, these men had been together for a number of months. They had been through all of the challenges of first just deciding to volunteer, of the training, of the non-existent or inadequate uniforms and equipment, substandard pay, the transit south, and they had endured battle together. Through all that, they came to know each other and to rely on each other and trust in each other.
I ain't much about no friends, huh? I ain't never had no family. Killed off my mama. You feel funny, right? Come on now. You doing fine. Well, I just... y'all's the onlyest family I got.
Well, that's our family. That's all right.
And, I love the 54.
Right.
Ain't much a matter what happened to Mom. But we men ain't.
Yes, sir. Amen.
Men ain't.
Yes.
As the 54th begins its march out onto the beach, it's going to pass some other regiments. One of them is supposed to depict the 10th Connecticut that they protected at the battle a couple days earlier.
Ready, kinda.
Show, Pierce. Best seat in the house.
I wonder if you might do something for me. I have some letters here. Personal things.
Certainly, Colonel.
Also, if I should fall, remember what you see here.
In this instance, the reporter Pierce is the one who told this story.
You men are relieved. Report to the rear as stretcher bearers. Do it now!
Forward, march!
You go on, honey. We be by directly.
If this man should fall, who will lift the flag and carry on?
I will.
I'll see you in the fort, Thomas. Fix! Bayonets! Shoulder! Arms! Charge! Bayonets! At the quick step! Forward! March! Double quick time! March!
In 1897, a monument to the 54th was unveiled on Boston Common with veterans in attendance, as you can see in this photograph here. The monument was designed by Auguste Saint-Gaudens, and you can see it's quite a large monument, 11 feet high and 14 feet wide. So what are we to make of this film's attempt at recreating history? Well, first let me say again that I agree with my colleagues who object to all the falsehoods and inaccuracies in historically based films. And in some respects, Glory is no exception for the handful of errors I've pointed out along with some others that I haven't mentioned. But first, let's remember it's not a documentary, right? It's a feature film. And secondly, let me return at this point to the proposition I made early in our time together this evening, and that is that for most Americans, historical movies provide one of their few emotional links to the past. Yet when movie makers set out to create a film, and I'm having to make an assumption here because I'm not a filmmaker, one of their hopes has to be that the film will elicit some sort of emotional response. And I don't doubt that those who make war movies are really any different. And one of the ways they seek that emotional response is through demonstrations of things like camaraderie and courage and sacrifice. And it's here that some movies, I believe, successfully convey, if not absolute objective historical facts, at least a symbolic or an emotional truth about history, and maybe more specifically about war. Another classic illustration of this point is the film Saving Private Ryan and the first 30 minutes of that movie. And in this part of the scene, where we see Tom Hanks' character, Captain Miller, who had not been in combat before, struggling to get out of the water, crawling up onto the beach and trying to make sense of what he was witnessing, the reality of war. We see him, I think, reacting as any normal human being would. He is confused, he is dazed, he is paralyzed. And all emotions that I think most of us can probably empathize with. That scene also goes on to show another reality, in that our individuals, ordinary men like Captain Miller here, overcame that human response to accomplish something that was extraordinary. War movies, I think, can remind us of how ordinary people have done extraordinary things, like those in Washington's Continental Army who faced down the British in the Revolution, or the men of the 54th who charged Fort Wagner, or all the real Captain Millers in our nation's past. Today there is so much, including movies, that seemingly glorifies the degrading, the degenerate, the destructive, the darker side of our human experience. But films such as these, scenes like the 54th at Fort Wagner, elicit emotion and celebrate the virtuous and the honorable, the best of our human nature and our collective past. And to me, that is as much part of our history as any objective, indisputable fact. Aside from its accuracies and inaccuracies, Glory tells the story of those who fought for liberty and freedom for themselves and for their country. Abraham Lincoln certainly understood this. And thinking of that self-evident truth upon which America was founded, that all are created equal, Lincoln made this observation: there will be some black men who can remember that with silent tongue, with clenched teeth, with a steady eye, and a well-poised bayonet, they have helped mankind on to that great consummation. While I fear there will be some white men unable to forget that with malignant heart and deceitful speech, they have strove to hinder it. And so while their facts may at times be suspect, good historical movies do have the ability to make an emotional connection, to draw our hearts to the past. And my hope as a historian is that wherever our hearts go, that our heads will then soon follow. Thank you again for coming out tonight.
Thank you, sir, and we would be glad to take some questions now. We'll keep our question and answer period to about 10 to 15 minutes. So if you do come up to the microphone with a question, make sure you have a question, not just a comment. And also, please do use the microphones. We aren't streaming this live, but we are recording it for later, so that way people will hear you. Go ahead, sir.
Sure, great lecture. Thank you very much. What war or military experience has not been made into a movie yet that is like on your list or top on your list to be turned into film?
War or movie that has not been made into a film on top of my list. I'm going to go down to a very specific battle, and that is the Battle of Lafayette Bridge in Normandy on D-Day and the first few days after. I think it's accounted as one of the most difficult and brutal fights of the entire war that very few people know about. I think that would make a great film, as well as anything with Ulysses S. Grant would make a great film. Right, thank you for the question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I did want to say a comment quickly. That monument is right across the driveway, I guess you'd say, of the state capitol for Boston. I've seen it. It's amazing to see it. This is picky, but is it correct that the actor playing Frederick Douglass was depicted a little older, maybe, than Frederick Douglass was in the 1860s? And secondly, having looked at many Civil War, I've been to many battlefields, but looking at many Civil War atlases, that they depicted the ocean to the left was the ocean to the right in the real Fort Wagner attack. I believe I've seen a map, and I was going, that's a little bit different than what. And one last thing, too. At the very last scene where they show, just as the cannon ends the assault, I taught history, and I used this movie, 2 pieces of it, because time constraints, the beginning and the end. And we always talked about the end where it's like a statue. The lieutenant, a colonel with the sword, and the other, and then then the cannon goes up. Anyway, that we always would talk about how that was depicting quite a scene. Anyway, those are my questions and my comment.
Yeah, as far as the first question, in the film, Frederick Douglass is depicted as older, grayer hair than he would have had at the time. I suspect that for the filmmakers, they did that because most people recognize Frederick Douglass from the second image I showed with great hair, this lion of a figure. So to make him as readily recognizable, I suspect that's why the filmmakers did that. As far as the direction of the attack on Fort Wagner by the 54th, the film shows them advancing from north to south with the sea, the ocean on their left. In actuality, the 54th made the assault south to north with the ocean on their right. One of my colleagues at Leavenworth has done a lot of work on the 54th, including talking to people involved in the production. He has no idea, nor do I, why they switched it around. The light was correct. The light was coming from the soldiers' right, which would have been west, because it was a late day attack. But why they are going south to north, I'm sure some production filmmaker said, no, we have to turn it around.
Is that spot still there, or has the ocean changed?
It's been all pretty well turned up now by, yes, some erosion and such. In the direction of the attack, you're right. It is an inaccuracy in the film. To me, one that I don't really get too worked up about. Because, again, there are other issues there, as I was suggesting. But yes, correct.
Thank you for coming. That was a great lecture. It was really a pleasure to hear you speak. You mentioned Leavenworth, and Fort Leavenworth, the Buffalo Soldier, on the plaque, it says the 9th and the 10th. Could you talk a little bit about the 9th and 10th and how they, time-wise, where they were? Because you talked about some of the first colored troops. Where were the 9th and 10th that are memorialized at Fort Leavenworth?
And I can say just a little bit about the 9th and the 10th because they actually were active after the Civil War. They come afterwards as veterans of the war and their capabilities on horseback. Those two regiments were created and they operated primarily on the frontier. So that's the 9th and the 10th and why they're memorialized there and why the big monument at Leavenworth, if you haven't seen it, it's an astounding monument. It is an equestrian monument with a buffalo soldier on horseback, but they are post-Civil War era.
Of course, to his everlasting shame, Woodrow Wilson called Birth of a Nation history writ large. But my question has to do with who was actually in the 54th. I have read that most of them were the Andre Braugher character, and very few runaway slaves. Is that right? Have you looked at that? What was the makeup of the soldiers in the 54th?
Yeah, the records that we have on the 54th, down to individual, is not as extensive as we might like or we might expect. We just know handfuls here and there of somewhere they came from. There were some former enslaved, and there were a significant number of free men, such as, again, Frederick Douglass's two sons. Since you bring up who is in the 54th, in the film, and I have yet to determine why the filmmakers did this, the sort of second officer that's portrayed in the film is a Major Forbes. There is very little record of Major Forbes, and he was in the regiment, but we know very little about what he did. The second in command was a lieutenant colonel named Edward Hollowell, and he was right next to Shaw in the assault. He's significantly wounded. He does survive, and he will later take over command of the 54th. But he gets no mention in the film at all, and for whatever reason, they went to Major Forbes. Now, Major Forbes' father was one of the prominent abolitionist families in New England, but that to me is not a reason why the filmmakers would have turned to Major Forbes. An agreement about Woodrow Wilson, making it even worse, he was a historian.
We'll take one more question. Go ahead, sir.
If I'm not mistaken, this is the film where early in the film they show a battle line that seemed to me probably more realistic than most film versions. I'd just like you to comment whether or not that's the case and
Yeah, very, very early in the film is depicted an assault at the Battle of Antietam on September 17th of 1862, the most costly day for Union forces in American history, or at least, I'm sorry, for the Civil War. And there is a depiction of an assault in which Colonel Shaw, at the time Captain Shaw, participates, in which he's slightly wounded, and that sort of sets up Shaw as an individual who has participated in the war. He has seen combat. He knows what he's getting into by taking command of the 54th. And as such battle scenes go, I'd say relatively realistic. Right. Thank you all again for coming. I appreciate it. Hopefully we'll see you in 2 weeks.